So today we're talking about the inverse of functions. Basically, the inverse of a function is when we swap the x and the y values of a function to get a new function or a new relation. In this question, we're given a function, f of x, and asked to solve for f inverse of 16. And we know we're asked about the inverse because there's a -1 is a superscript on our f. In part B, we're asked to solve for when f inverse of x equals 4. To answer either of these questions, the first thing we have to do is determine the inverse of f of x. What we know is f of x equals 6 times x minus 1 plus 4. Remember that f of x is just a fancy way of writing y. So we can rewrite this as y equals 6 times x minus 1 plus 4. To get f inverse of x, we're going to swap the x and the y. So anytime we see a y, we'll write an x, and anytime we see an x, we'll write a y. So this becomes, instead of y equals, this will become x equals 6 times, this x gets swapped to a y, minus 1 plus 4. Now we want to isolate our y. We want y on one side and everything else on the other. So to do this, we'll do BEDMAS only backwards. So we can subtract 4 from both sides. X minus 4 equals 6 times y minus 1. We'll divide everything by 6 to get rid of this. So we'll have x minus 4 divided by 6 equals y minus 1. And finally, we'll add 1 to both sides. So x minus 4 over 6 plus 1 equals y. Now that we've isolated for y, this part is our f inverse of x. So f inverse of x equals x minus 4 over 6 plus 1. Now that we have our inverse function, we can start solving questions A and B. Question A asks to solve for f inverse of 16. So let's start with what we know. We know f inverse of x equals x minus 4 over 6 plus 1. If we're looking at f inverse of 16, all that means is that our x value is 16. So we want to evaluate this when x is 16. So instead of writing x, we'll write 16, and everything else stays the same. And now we can solve this. 16 minus 4 is 12, still divided by 6, plus 1. 12 divided by 6 is 2, plus 1. 2 plus 1 is 3. Therefore, f inverse of 16 is 3. For part B, what we're asked to do is to solve f inverse of x equals 4. Well, we know what f inverse of x is, so let's write that. F inverse of x is x minus 4 over 6 plus 1. We want to know when this equals 4. So to do that, we'll solve for x now. We can subtract 1 from both sides, and we get x minus 4 over 6 equals 4 minus 1, which is 3. Multiply both sides by 6, so x minus 4 equals 6 times 3 is 18. And finally, add 4 to both sides. We're left with x equals 22. Therefore, when f inverse of x equals 4, x equals 22. So you see, once we find the inverse of a function, it's quite easy to either replace x and solve, or to set the inverse function equal to a number and solve for x.